With the Australian Grand Prix completed, one race down and 23 still to come, we're headed straight into the Chinese Grand Prix, which is also a sprint weekend. So which driver do you think is going to come out on top? Who might get themselves a surprise podium? And which driver is most likely to flop in Shanghai? As much as the Australian Grand Prix's madness made for an incredibly entertaining start to the season, which I really wouldn't change for anything because it was so enthralling every single lap, the mixed weather conditions and the fact that the Australian Grand Prix track is a little bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the tracks on the calendar does mean that we don't have a full reflection on every team's pace going into this weekend, but the Shanghai circuit will give us a much better look at the real pace of each team, especially considering the mix of corners that you get in Shanghai and the tyre compounds that are available to the teams this weekend. Of course, all eyes will be on the mini DRS saga, something that's been rumbling behind the scenes since Baku last year, where we saw a little opening on Oscar Piastri's rear wing on those very long straights in Azerbaijan. The changes that were supposed to come in for the Japanese Grand Prix weekend have been forced through a little bit early and instead will be coming to this weekend in China, after McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari were all pushing their luck a little bit too much for the FIA's liking when it came to the flexibility of their rear wings. So the regulations around that rear wing flexibility is changing already. Of course, with the flexi wing changes also coming to the front wings for the Spanish Grand Prix. Red Bull have been pushing for this quite heavily alongside some of the other teams towards the rear end of the grid. And considering Max was the closest to the McLarens, with this rule change coming in, he should be the one that you expect to be even closer to the papaya cars, although it shouldn't take away too much overall performance from the McLarens, and I do think they'll still have the edge over the rest of the field, but it will be interesting to see how it also affects the Ferrari cars and the Mercedes cars as we move forwards throughout the season. With that said though, let's get straight into the predictions that you guys have voted on for the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, and if you want to get involved in these votes in the future, subscribe to the channel and check the posts tab on the Monday of every race week to get your votes in. When it comes to the flop team, there's no surprise here really that 32.6% of you guys thought that Haas would have the worst weekend in China. And it really is surprising how much slower they were in Australia than we were expecting them to be. Throughout 2024, it felt like they made a lot of really good progress, but coming into 2025, they kind of shocked everybody in the negative sense, where Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman were so far off the pace. In qualifying, I know that we didn't get to see Ollie Behrman, but Esteban Ocon was miles off making it through to Q2. And then when it came to the race, I know that it was wet, so it's not fully representative of their pace, but still they finished 13th and 14th, last of the cars that finished the race, and never felt like they were putting anyone ahead of them under pressure at any point. Although I do think it's quite interesting how the tables have turned on Ferrari. Going into the Australian Grand Prix, a lot of people were very positive about their championship hopes. You guys have voted them as the second most likely team to have a flop weekend in China. I think you're being a little bit harsh. The Ferrari team set their car up for a wet weather race, which was why their qualifying wasn't as good as they'd have hoped it to be. And then alongside that, by the time we actually got racing, the track was starting to dry and they already had made a lot of strategy mistakes. And by that point, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton were just nowhere. Plus the extra safety car really played against them, so they dropped down the order massively. Basically what I'm trying to say is I don't think they'll be behind Stake Sauber in the Formula One Constructors' Championships for that long. Then on the flip side of that, the team that you voted to have the best weekend was unanimous. McLaren got 81.4% of your vote as likely to be the best team going into the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, and you can't really argue with this. Obviously a 1-2 in qualifying, with Lando Norris starting ahead of Oscar Piastri in the dry conditions, and then in the wet conditions in Australia, they also continued to show their dominance. Lando and Oscar were escaping away from Max Verstappen up until that moment where both of them decided to have a little go through the gravel. Obviously much more disheartening for Oscar Piastri as he then also ended up on the grass on the outside of turn 13. But had he not done that, he would have likely finished the race in second, maybe even put Lando under pressure for the lead as he was catching up to the back of Norris before they then had to deal with all the back markers and problems at that point in the race. I think McLaren have shown that they're definitely the team to beat right now. Then we move on to the driver predictions, and the driver that you think will have the worst weekend and struggle the most is Lewis Hamilton with 18.6% of the vote. And how the tables have turned so quickly. Obviously, that first weekend in a Ferrari, there was so much positivity. He felt really positive about going into this new challenge at Ferrari, but it just hasn't quite stuck yet. A lot of the radio messages between Lewis and his new race engineer were quite difficult to listen to. I think there's a lot still to learn for Lewis Hamilton, and it's going to be a much bigger learning curve than we were expecting it to be going into his first season at Ferrari. And talking of learning curves, you could argue that Liam Lawson is also on a pretty similar one. He got absolutely schooled by Max Verstappen, as all of Max Verstappen teammates do, but he also put it in the barriers and didn't get out of Q1. I don't want to start making Sergio Perez connections already, but that was a very Sergio Perez performance that ended up with the Mexican losing his seat at the end of last year. Lawson needs to improve very quickly so that he doesn't start getting put into that kind of conversation too early. I think it's a little bit harsh to have Jack Doohan and Ollie Behrman here. Jack Doohan, I know that he crashed in the race very early on, but actually before that, in qualifying, he nearly got through to Q3 had it not been for the yellow flag as Lewis Hamilton spun in front of him, and he wasn't too far off the pace of Pierre Gasly throughout the whole weekend. And then similar with Ollie Behrman, I think it's a little bit harsh to put him there. I know it was his fault that he didn't get much running in Australia, because when he did crash in free practice 1, that then spiraled the rest of his weekend. And then in the race, he did keep it clean, but as we've talked about before, the Haas car was just nowhere near as good as we thought it was going to be. I'm hoping that this weekend can be the first real weekend that Ollie Behrman gets behind that Haas wheel, doesn't crash in the first free practice session, gets a full go throughout the sprint race and the Grand Prix, and we see what he can really do in that Haas car. Moving on to more positive things, you guys voted for Kimi Antonelli to be the good surprise of the weekend, possibly even sneaking his first podium for Mercedes. I wouldn't go as far to say that he might win the race. I know that he's got 2 Grand Prix left, where if he does win a race, he'll become the youngest winner in Formula 1 history, beating out Max Verstappen's record. I think that's maybe a little bit too far, but if he can get onto the podium, that would be absolutely insane. But I can completely understand why you guys have voted for this, because that drive in Australia in the wet conditions was just so impressive. Starting P16, obviously we didn't get to see his full qualifying pace because of the damage that there was on that Mercedes car. Hopefully we'll get to see his full qualifying pace this weekend, but he was just so smooth. And you've got obviously Bortoletto, Doohan and Hadjar all in the wall as rookies. Kimi Antonelli has the least experience of the rookies on the grid. He's the youngest of them and managed to keep it clean. And then you look at the fact that really experienced drivers like Carlos Sainz and Fernando Alonso, literally the most experienced driver on the entire Formula 1 grid ever, and Kimi manages to finish P4. It was a very, very good drive. And I was a little bit on the fence of Kimi Antonelli. I thought he might need a little bit of time to adapt to Formula 1, but I'll tell you what, Toto Wolff was right. He's hit the ground running and was really, really exciting to watch. Then second place, you've got Carlos Sainz. That crash on lap 1 was really disappointing, because the rest of the weekend for Williams was almost perfect. They got both of the cars through to Q3. They looked really, really solid in their race pace with Alex Albon. And in fact, Alex Albon can be very, very happy. Came into the season with a lot of pressure to perform, with Carlos Sainz coming in beside him as his teammate. It was his first real challenge, and he is definitely 1-0 up when it comes to that. An incredible drive from Alex Albon and some really good points for the Williams team. But I would like to see what Carlos Sainz can do in that Williams car in the race conditions. And let's see, can he match Alex Albon in China? Which leads us to our final prediction, the race winner and the podium sitters for the 2025 Chinese Grand Prix. And you guys in P4 have put Charles Leclerc with 8.33% of the vote. Oscar Piastri in P3, just standing on the podium there with 23.1% of the vote. Very, very close to Max Verstappen, who you've put P2 with 24.2% of the vote. And Lando Norris winning the Grand Prix with 48.8% of you, nearly 50% of all the Formula 1 fans on this channel thinking Lando Norris is going to come out on top in China. I would absolutely love this, because it would be really good for the McLaren team. It would continue to put them at the top of the constructor standings and just slightly elongate that lead in the Drivers' Championship with Lando Norris, which he really does need if he's going to keep Max Verstappen at bay throughout the whole of the 2025 season, especially with those flexi wing changes coming, as we don't know how much that's going to affect the McLaren car moving forwards for the rest of the season from both China and from Spain onwards to the end of Abu Dhabi. Of course, we'll be live on the channel covering all 4 competitive sessions this weekend in China, so make sure you subscribe and don't miss any of those. Let me know your predictions down in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this video, you'll also probably enjoy this video here, where I predict the 2025 championship from 20th all the way up to 1st.